Hey guys, tonight we're going to sink slowly into the murky backstreets of medieval Europe, a place where crime wasn't exactly a rare event. In fact, half the people you'd pass on a 14th century street corner were probably breaking some kind of law, whether they knew it or not. So dim the lights, maybe grab a cup of something warm, and let's drift back to a time before police, before fingerprints, before the idea of rehabilitation, because in the Middle Ages justice was less about reform and more about creative punishment. Now, when we think of medieval criminals, we tend to imagine hooded bandits or Robin Hood types. Maybe a shady man with a dagger lurking in an alley, or a highway robber dramatically stopping a noble's carriage under the moonlight. But most criminals weren't nearly that romantic. They were tired, hungry, often broke, and, let's be honest, not very good at crime. Some stole chickens, others faked miracles, and a few got creative enough to make it into the dusty pages of history. So tonight, we're going to meet them, the pickpockets, imposters, serial confessors, grave robbers, and self-proclaimed prophets who made medieval life a little more chaotic and a lot more interesting. The chicken thieves of Paris. Let's start small. Paris in the late 13th century, a maze of narrow alleys, open sewers, and suspiciously watchful neighbors. Crime was common here, mostly because survival was hard. If you stole a loaf of bread, you were desperate. If you stole a chicken, you were bold. A chicken wasn't just dinner, it was property, a feathered investment. So when a man named Guillaume Lecoq, yes, William the Rooster, got caught stealing hens from a local butcher, it was practically poetic. He claimed he only wanted to feed his family. The judge, unimpressed, sentenced him to be paraded through the market with a chicken tied around his neck, because humiliation, not prison, was the medieval favorite. The crowd laughed, threw rotten onions, and probably went home feeling better about themselves. Guillaume went home smelling like poultry. Everyone, in some twisted way, got what they wanted. The career criminals nobody could catch her. Let's move from Paris to England, land of damp castles, muddy roads, and a crime problem big enough to require royal clerks to keep lists of repeat offenders. And here we meet Adam le Lombard, a man so famous for thievery that even chroniclers got tired of writing about him. Adam wasn't violent. He just stole everything. Horses, cloaks, fish from market stalls. He even robbed church donation boxes, which was bold even by 14th century standards. The problem was, he was annoyingly good at escaping. Medieval jails weren't exactly maximum security facilities. A few rusty chains, a sleepy guard, maybe a hole in the wall. Adam escaped 3 times. Each time he came back to the same village, because apparently hiding in plain sight was his version of strategy. Eventually, the local sheriff got tired of it and offered Adam a deal: join the army in France or hang. Adam chose France. He was never heard from again, which in medieval terms probably means he died of dysentery before stealing anyone's lunch. The fake saint of Bologna. Now let's float south to sunny Italy, the perfect place for scams, especially religious ones. Meet Bartolomeo di Pistoia, a wandering monk who discovered that people really wanted miracles. So he gave them miracles. He'd show up in small towns claiming to have visions, performing fake healings, and conveniently collecting donations for holy causes. In one village, he claimed to have resurrected a goat. In another, he made wine appear from his walking stick, which turned out to have a hidden compartment. You'd think someone would catch on, but medieval people loved a good show. Eventually, a local bishop investigated and realized Bartolomeo's divine relic was a mummified rat painted gold. The church banned him, but because this was the Middle Ages, he just shaved his beard, changed his name, and started again 2 towns over. If reincarnation were real, Bartolomeo would have made an excellent 18th century stage magician. The knight who became a bandit let switch gears a bit, because not all criminals were poor or desperate. Some were just bad at being noble. Meet Eustace the monk. Yes, he started as an actual monk, quiet, educated, and slightly too ambitious. Then he got bored, so he became a pirate. This was around the early 1200s, and Eustace somehow managed to reinvent himself as both a monk and a sea bandit. He terrorized the English Channel, switching sides between France and England whenever it suited him. At one point, both kings put bounties on his head. He was captured, pardoned, betrayed, captured again, and finally beheaded, all before turning 50. Historians sometimes call him the most confusing man of the 13th century, mostly because nobody could figure out what he actually wanted: redemption, gold, or just attention. The woman who stole the whole identity. Finally, for tonight's part, we drift into something a little stranger. Meet Jeanne de Clisson, a noblewoman from Brittany. Her husband was executed by the French king for supposed treason, and Jeanne, instead of quietly mourning, decided to become a pirate herself. She sold everything she owned, bought a ship, painted it black, and called it My Revenge. Yes, seriously. She attacked French vessels for over a decade, leaving no survivors. The English called her the Lioness of Brittany. The French called her that woman. Eventually, she retired, remarried, and lived peacefully in England. No one ever punished her, because apparently being terrifying and noble meant you could retire like nothing happened. So, we left off with noble pirates and chicken thieves. Let's drift now into something a little colder. The kind of crime that starts in graveyards, ends in courtrooms, and somehow manages to be both disgusting and weirdly practical. Because in the Middle Ages, if something could be stolen, it probably was. Even bodies. The grave robbers of London. Let's start in 14th century London, a city that never smelled great even on a good day. After the Black Death, the cemeteries were overflowing. Bodies everywhere, and as grim as it sounds, some people looked at that and thought, free merchandise. These were the resurrection men, early grave robbers who dig up freshly buried corpses. Their goal? To sell the remains to doctors, alchemists, or, more commonly, to people who believed ground-up bones could cure diseases. Yes, human dust was basically medieval aspirin. It wasn't technically illegal at first. Since medieval law had no clear rules about corpses, you could get fined for stealing a cow. But a human skull? That was just unfortunate. There's one famous case, a man named Roger of Barking, who was caught with 2 bags of bones, a shovel, and a suspiciously smug expression. When questioned, he claimed the bones were his late uncle's, and he was merely relocating them. The court didn't buy it. He was pilloried for 3 days, a sort of medieval timeout where people threw cabbage at you, and then released. Honestly, compared to modern sentencing, that's practically a weekend retreat. The medieval counterfeiters. Next up, the counterfeiters. Because if there's one universal truth across all of human history, it's that someone is always trying to print fake money. In the 1300s, coinage was serious business. Coins were silver, sometimes gold, and biting them was actually a legitimate test. But people soon realized that if you shaved off a little silver dust from each coin, just a sliver, you could melt it down and make new coins. A brilliant idea, until you were caught. One of the most notorious offenders was Thomas of Lynn, a goldsmith who decided to supplement his income by mixing copper with silver. He got away with it for years because, frankly, nobody could tell the difference in candlelight. When he was finally discovered, he blamed his apprentice. The apprentice blamed the devil's temptation. The court unsurprisingly blamed both. They were hanged together, proving that in medieval England your job security depended entirely on not being too clever. But the best part, afterward, the king issued a decree reminding citizens that improving coinage was not a civic duty, because apparently enough people were doing it that clarification was necessary. The fraudulent pilgrims. Next we drift south again, this time to the dusty roads of Spain and Italy, where pilgrims trudged toward holy shrines, or at least pretended to. Being a pilgrim had perks: free lodging, food, and occasionally a few coins from sympathetic nobles. So of course a few people made it a career. Meet Hildegard the Pious, who wasn't particularly pious, or named Hildegard. She traveled from town to town wearing a tattered cloak, carrying fake relics, a feather from the Archangel Michael, a tooth of St. Peter, and, rather optimistically, sand from the Garden of Eden. She could weep on command, pray in Latin badly, and always left just before the local clergy started asking questions. She was eventually caught when two other fake pilgrims recognized her and exposed her scam, apparently jealous that she was better at faking holiness than they were. Her punishment? She was sentenced to walk barefoot from one shrine to another, as an actual pilgrim this time. Ironically, she did it so convincingly that people started donating again, which means she turned her punishment back into a business. Truly a professional. The corpse swappers, now this one's darker, but still, somehow it feels on brand for the Middle Ages. Execution was common, but burial was expensive. So families would sometimes sneak into the gallows field at night, steal their relative's body, and replace it with someone else's, often a pauper's. That way, they could secretly bury their loved one in consecrated ground. The church hated this. The priests called it grave mischief, which sounds like a children's book but wasn't. In one case, a gravedigger in York noticed that a recently buried criminal seemed to have shrunk by about a foot. When they checked, it wasn't the criminal. It was an entirely different man, with no head. The family was found, fined, and ironically forgiven once they paid the church a cleansing donation, in other words, a bribe. Because nothing said holy redemption quite like financial compensation. The church forgery business. Speaking of bribes, forgers were another thriving medieval profession. Not the coin kind, the holy document kind. Imagine you're a small monastery. The rent is high, the roof leaks, and the bishop keeps asking for donations. Solution? Just forge an old letter from Charlemagne, saying he donated you 50 acres of land. This happened constantly. Monks had great handwriting and zero oversight. By the 12th century, historians estimate that nearly half of ancient royal decrees in European archives were complete fabrications. One monk, brother, Anselm of Tours, even wrote a fake papal bull claiming his abbey had the exclusive right to host angels. The Pope eventually caught on, but apparently laughed and said, "Well, that's creative." Anselm wasn't punished, probably because even the Vatican knew you had to respect the hustle. The alchemists who weren't, and now, the alchemists. Medieval scientists, dreamers, and con artists all in one. Everyone wanted to make gold, cure disease, or live forever. Most ended up just exploding things, but a few realized that pretending to do alchemy was easier than actually learning it. One of them was Ulrich von Wittenberg, a self-proclaimed alchemist who claimed he could multiply metals. He convinced several noblemen to fund his lab, basically a smoky basement full of jars and wishful thinking. For months he'd perform fake experiments, pouring colored water between beakers and nodding seriously. Whenever someone asked to see results, he'd say the stars weren't aligned yet. Eventually, one noble got suspicious and checked the gold Ulrich produced. It was brass. When confronted, Ulrich tried to escape by claiming the brass was spiritually gold, which honestly was a decent try. He was banished, but not before conning a bishop into hiring him again. You'd think word would spread, but medieval networking was slow. Let's drift gently to another kind of thief, not of money or bodies, but of stories. The impostors of the royal courts. There was always someone pretending to be someone else. Lost heirs, missing princes, miracle-born knights. Medieval Europe was basically one big identity scam. The most famous was Lambert Simnel, who claimed to be the rightful king of England in the 1480s. He was 12, and yes, people believed him. He gathered an army, was defeated and captured. Now most pretenders ended up headless, but King Henry VII looked at this kid and apparently thought, he's too cute to kill. So instead, he gave him a job as a kitchen servant. Lambert spent the rest of his life serving roast goose to the same nobles who once swore loyalty to him. A quiet, humbling ending, but probably the safest one he could have hoped for. Welcome back. If you're still awake, congratulations. You've officially lasted longer than most medieval alchemists' experiments. Tonight, we're floating deeper into the quieter, colder side of medieval crime. Assassination, poison, and the slow art of political revenge. The kind of crime that didn't happen in alleys, but in candle-lit halls where everyone smiled too much. The dinner guests from hell in the 15th century, Florence was basically a political time bomb. Every noble family had enemies, secret alliances, and at least one cousin who'd poison you for a promotion. Enter the Pazzi conspiracy, 1478. The Medici family ruled Florence. They were rich, smug, and mostly untouchable, until the Pazzi decided they'd had enough. Their plan was bold. Kill Lorenzo de' Medici and his brother during Mass, in the middle of a cathedral. Because apparently nothing says good strategy like stabbing people in front of God. The attack failed. Lorenzo survived. The assassins didn't. They were dragged through the streets, hanged from the windows of City Hall and left there as a reminder. A reminder that in Florence, crime wasn't a question of morality, just of execution timing. The Duchess and her perfume now. Let's drift to Italy again, because if there's one place where poison became fashionable, it was Renaissance Italy. Perfume, cosmetics, jewelry, and death, all sold together. One of the most notorious poisoners was Giulia Tofana. She lived in the 1600s, slightly after the medieval window. But spiritually she fits right in. Giulia sold something called aqua tofana, a clear, odorless liquid. It came in small bottles labeled as cosmetics, but it wasn't for the skin. It was for husbands. Hundreds of women allegedly bought it to escape bad marriages. Giulia told them, 3 drops for sickness, 4 for peace. When she was finally caught, she calmly confessed to over 600 deaths. Her only regret? That her business had been interrupted. The church called her a monster. Modern historians call her an early advocate for divorce reform. Perspective really is everything. The monk who murdered kings by accident. Let's move north again, to France, and to Jean de Marigny, a monk with terrible luck and worse timing. He wasn't actually a murderer. He was just nearby. Every time Jean attended a royal event, someone died. A prince fell from a horse. A duke choked on bread. A count got crushed by a chandelier. People started whispering that he was cursed. Jean swore he wasn't. He even wrote a letter to the Pope asking for an exorcism, for the sake of my reputation. Eventually, the king banned him from attending any more ceremonies, which ironically kept everyone alive. No poison, no daggers, just a man whose presence apparently offended mortality itself. The political poison clubs, meanwhile, over in the German principalities, poison wasn't personal, it was professional. There were secret guilds of women known for selling discreet solutions to political problems. They were usually herbalists, healers, or widows. They called their poisons quieting waters, which sounds gentle enough until you realize it was code for please remove my cousin from the inheritance list. One group in Augsburg was led by Greta the Mild, a name that sounds innocent until you read her records. She brewed potions so effective that local nobles actually started hiring her as a political consultant. Eventually, she was arrested, but instead of being executed, she was put under house arrest because even the bishop admitted her skills might be useful someday. Medieval justice, everyone, where crimes were bad, unless you were good at them. The assassins who couldn't aim over in England, assassinations were a little less glamorous. Most plots failed, mainly because nobody had guns yet and daggers aren't great for subtlety. Take Sir John Holland, half-brother of King Richard II. He decided to remove a rival noble during a jousting tournament. Simple plan: tamper with the man's armor. He poured oil on the saddle, loosened a few bolts, and waited. The rival fell, yes, but survived, and then sued John for attempted murder in front of the king. John tried to deny everything, but a servant ratted him out. He was stripped of his titles, banished, and reportedly spent his exile thinking about what he'd done. Medieval crime and punishment, occasionally parental in tone. The good poisoners now. Believe it or not, some poisoners had good intentions. Doctors, healers, and nuns often experimented with plants like belladonna and hemlock. Not for murder, but for pain relief. Except dosage was not their strong point. One nun, Sister Beatrix of Mainz, mixed herbal tonics for the sick. Unfortunately, she kept forgetting which jar was which. After the 5th miracle death, the abbess banned her from the infirmary and reassigned her to candle making. Beatrix accepted the decision gracefully, saying, "I'm better with wax than people anyway." And she wasn't wrong. The royal poison tester's nightmare, and of course, there were the food tasters. Those brave, unlucky souls who had one job: eat, and hope you live. In the court of King Charles VI of France, the one who thought he was made of glass, the royal taster, Pierre de la Mare, supposedly tasted every dish before it reached the king's table. Soups, wines, pastries, all tested for safety. He lived in constant terror. Once, after eating a slightly sour tart, Pierre fainted on the spot. The kitchen panicked. The king panicked. Turned out it was just bad cream, but the damage was done. Charles refused to eat for 2 days. Pierre retired soon after, claiming his nerves were too modern for medieval service, and with that we drift quietly from death by design to death by stupidity, because Part 4 is about those criminals who weren't exactly evil, just very, very dumb. Part 4. The dumbest criminals in the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages weren't short on stupidity. Between superstition, desperation, and the occasional goat costume, there's no shortage of stories that make you wonder how humanity survived. The drunk bishop in 1320. A French bishop named Etienne de Besançon decided to test whether holy wine could ever go bad. He drank a full barrel, then declared himself miraculously blessed and tried to baptize his horse. When the king's guards arrested him, he insisted he was conducting theological research. The church quietly demoted him to librarian, where he could do less damage. The thief who robbed himself in Germany. There's a documented case of a man named Klaus the Cobbler who reported a robbery to the town guard. He said someone had stolen his purse while he was drunk. After 3 days of searching, the guards found the purse in Klaus's own chimney. He had hidden it from imaginary thieves and forgotten. He was fined for wasting municipal time, which might be the most polite medieval insult ever recorded. The peasant prophet. Then there was Oswald the Inspired. A farmer who claimed angels told him to stop paying taxes. When the sheriff arrived, Oswald shouted, "The Lord is my landlord," and locked himself in a chicken coop. After a day and a half, he surrendered, saying, "The Lord has changed his mind." He was sentenced to clean the churchyard for a year, where he apparently preached to worms. Truly, a man ahead of his time. The great cheese heist, one of my personal favorites, the cheese riots of Coventry, 1439. When the city raised cheese prices, local apprentices stormed the market shouting, "Let us have our cheddar." They looted stalls, ate everything, and passed out from lactose overload the punishment. Public whipping and, somewhat cruelly, a lifelong ban on dairy. A tragic end for men who only wanted affordable Gouda. The man who tried to sue God finally. There's Conrad of Ulm, a merchant who lost his fortune in a flood. He filed a complaint with the local bishop, stating that God had violated his property rights. The bishop, trying not to laugh, said the case couldn't proceed because the defendant could not be summoned. Conrad apparently replied, "Then I'll wait until Judgment Day," which is technically still pending. By the later Middle Ages, crime wasn't just about desperation anymore. It was about reputation and redemption, because in a world obsessed with sin, confessing your crimes could be more fashionable than not committing them in the first place. The knight who regretted everything. Let's start with Sir Robert de Vere. He was rich, spoiled, and permanently in trouble. He stole land, insulted bishops, and once punched a royal advisor at a banquet because the man looked smug. After years of chaos, Robert apparently had a divine revelation during a thunderstorm. He rode barefoot to Canterbury Cathedral, yes, barefoot, and confessed his sins aloud to whoever happened to be there. Most of them were peasants who didn't care, but Robert wept, promised to repent, and even donated a portion of his land to the poor. Unfortunately, it wasn't actually his land. He'd already stolen it, so his act of redemption caused a second lawsuit. He died shortly after, reportedly at peace and in debt. The pickpocket who became a saint almost. Then there was Stephen of Beziers, a small-time pickpocket with big ambitions. He robbed pilgrims, priests, even other thieves. But one day he stole a gold crucifix from a monk and immediately broke out in hives. Convinced it was divine punishment, Stephen turned himself in, confessed, and begged forgiveness. The court, touched by his sudden rash-induced piety, sentenced him to join a monastery instead of execution. He did. And he actually stayed. For 30 years he served as a quiet, humble brother, the monastery's best gardener. After his death, locals started calling him Saint Stephen the Penitent. He was never canonized officially, but to this day, a few small French churches keep little wooden carvings of him, holding a stolen crucifix and a very guilty expression. The forger who repented by writing psalms, one of my favorites. Gerhard von Mainz, a document forger who specialized in fake indulgences, papers that forgave your sins for a fee. He was good, too good. The church eventually caught him when a bishop noticed one indulgence was dated for the year 1367 before Christ. Facing death, Gerhard begged to be allowed to prove his repentance by copying the Bible by hand. The judge, possibly amused, and agreed. It took him 16 years. When he finally finished, his eyesight was gone and his hands trembled. The bishop who had sentenced him was dead. Gerhard's final act was to write shakily in the margin of the last page, "The Lord forgave my spelling." Then he died. And the book, believe it or not, still exists, locked in a small cathedral library, covered in candle wax and regret. The thief who became a confessor in 14th century Spain. There was a man named Juan el Rapido, Juan the Quick. He was a highwayman famous for robbing travelers on pilgrimage routes. After 20 years, He was captured by knights returning from Granada. But instead of execution, something strange happened. Juan begged to confess one last time. His confession was so emotional, so detailed, that the priest himself started crying. Word spread. People started visiting Juan in prison just to listen to his repentance. When he died, the jailer said, he stole everything in life except his own soul. The church later turned his cell into a chapel. It's still there, tiny stone candle-lit, the last home of a man who stole gold and gave back tears, the queen who regretted the wrong thing, and finally, Joanna of Naples, a queen who ruled, loved, and schemed her way through 4 marriages and countless scandals. She was accused of murder, witchcraft, and sleeping with half her court, but her real regret, written in her final letter, wasn't what anyone expected. She wrote, "I should not have worn velvet in summer. That's it. No guilt, no confession, just fashion advice. In her defense, Naples is hot. We'll pause there and drift now into the final chapter, what happened after the crimes. Because medieval punishment wasn't just about justice. It was art. Terrible, bizarre art. You'd think after all this chaos that medieval punishments would be harsh, and you'd be right. But they were also creative, equal parts theater, revenge and low-budget morality play. The shame parade for small crimes, like lying, gossiping, or minor theft, the punishment wasn't death. It was humiliation. You'd be forced to walk through town wearing a ridiculous outfit, sometimes with a sign describing your crime. One woman who spread rumors was made to carry a live goose around her neck. Another who cheated at dice was forced to roll dice in the mud for hours while children threw pebbles. It was cruel, yes, but also weirdly civic, like a community theater nobody wanted to join. The talking heads of Prague in Bohemia, certain executed criminals were displayed with wooden signs over their heads, quoting their supposed last words. One famously read, "I told them it wasn't my cow." Another said, "If I return, it will not be voluntarily." People treated these heads like folk wisdom. Children whispered about them, lovers swore oaths beside them. Justice became folklore, and folklore became a bedtime story. Just like this one. The pillory of apologies in Germany, some towns offered optional mercy punishments. You could avoid whipping if you stood on a platform and apologized to everyone who came by individually. One merchant, caught cheating on grain weights, reportedly said, "I'm sorry," over 700 times in one day. By the end, he fainted. The guards considered it repentance through exhaustion. The animal trials, yes. Animals were actually put on trial. If a pig killed someone, it could be sentenced to death. If a rooster laid an egg, it was accused of witchcraft. In 1386, a French pig was publicly hanged for murdering a child. It was dressed in human clothes, a hat, gloves, and tiny boots. The crowd applauded. Historians still debate whether it was meant as justice, deterrence, or just an elaborate excuse for a fairground event. Probably all three. The accidental mercy of bureaucracy. The truth is, most criminals didn't survive long enough for poetic endings. But occasionally, paperwork saved them. A thief named Alain du Vieux-Pont was sentenced to hanging in 1427. The execution was delayed because the hangman got drunk. Then it rained. Then someone misplaced the rope. By the time they rescheduled, the king had died, and all sentences were automatically void. Alain walked free. He supposedly lived another 30 years, always keeping a spare rope just in case. The gentle kindness of forgetting, and finally, the quietest kind of justice, forgetting. Most medieval crimes were never recorded. Most punishments went unseen. And most people simply faded back into the muddy rhythm of daily life. There were too many sinners to count, too many regrets to write down. In the end, history remembers only the strange, the loud, the slightly absurd, the ones who made sin entertaining. But for every con artist and bandit, there were thousands who just stumbled through, stealing bread, breaking rules, trying to survive. And maybe that's what makes them oddly comforting, because in their clumsy, foolish way, they were just as human as we are. A quiet ending. So tonight we close the book on medieval crime, not with a bang, but a sigh. The thieves are gone. The gallows are empty. The chickens are safe. Somewhere in an old monastery library, a dusty manuscript still carries the words of a guilty monk asking forgiveness. Somewhere in an unmarked field, a skeleton rests that once wore a sign saying liar. And somewhere, a small wooden carving of a pickpocket turned saint still smiles faintly, holding his stolen crucifix. Because in the long, slow sleep of history, even criminals get to rest. The crimes nobody talked about, scandals, saints, and social catastrophes. So far we've met grave robbers, counterfeiters, pirates, poisoners, and a few too clever monks. But not every medieval crime involved theft or murder. Some were moral crimes, the kind that involved a lot of whispering, suspicious glances, and clerics pretending they weren't interested, because in medieval Europe, you could be jailed for almost anything, for wearing silk, for skipping church, for having the wrong haircut, or my personal favorite, for laughing at the wrong moment during Mass. Yes, somewhere in the 13th century, a man named Peter of Blois was fined for improper laughter before the host. What did he laugh at? No one knows. Probably a candle sputtering. But the record is very clear. Inappropriate levity. A crime so boring, it might just be perfect for tonight. The fashion criminals. Let's start with fashion, because nothing reveals human vanity quite like a medieval sumptuary law. These were laws designed to stop people from dressing above their station. In other words, if you were a baker, you couldn't wear velvet. If you were a peasant, no fur trim. If you were a merchant's wife, absolutely no gold thread, because that was apparently morally confusing. There's an English law from 1363 that literally says, "No servant of yeoman shall wear cloth above 2 marks the yard, nor any gown lined with fur save lamb or coney." Translation: if you're poor, you can wear cheap rabbit. Don't even think about ermine. And of course, everyone ignored these laws immediately. In Florence, tailors were fined for making illicitly extravagant sleeves, which apparently meant sleeves longer than your arm. One woman was caught wearing pearls on her shoes. She explained that they were small and humble pearls. The court disagreed. She was sentenced to public confession and a fine roughly equivalent to a month's rent, all for shiny shoes. The medieval gossip trials gossip too could be a crime. There was even a word for it: defamation by tongue. If you were caught spreading rumors about a neighbor, you could be forced to wear a wooden gossip bridle, a metal mask with a tongue clamp, and parade through the village. It sounds horrific, and yes, it was, but also absurd. Some masks were shaped like donkey heads or had bells attached. The goal wasn't pain, it was humiliation. With style, one woman in York named Agnes Parker was sentenced to wear the gossip bridle for slanderous words regarding another woman's hens. We don't know what she said, but whatever it was, it must have been truly scandalous poultry gossip. Afterward, the judge wrote that Agnes confessed her words and promised better silence. Honestly, that's a phrase I might start using. Promised better silence. It's beautiful. The bakers and their crimes, then there were the bakers. You might not expect bread to be controversial, but it was one of the most heavily regulated industries in medieval Europe. The Assize of Bread and Ale, 1256, dictated the exact weight and price of loaves. If your bread was even slightly too light, you were in trouble. Bakers caught cheating were punished by being paraded through town with their bread tied around their necks, which admittedly sounds like performance art. One London baker, John of Tyburn, was caught using cheap flour and claimed the wind blew some off the scale. The judge didn't buy it. He was placed in the pillory and pelted with, what else, stale bread. It's oddly poetic. A man punished by the very carbs he betrayed. The forbidden lovers, of course, some crimes were less about bread and more about love. Adultery was technically both a sin and a criminal offense, but only for women. A man caught with another woman might be fined, but a woman caught with another man could be flogged, shamed, or locked in a convent for re-education. There's a record from Paris, 1324. A noblewoman named Isabeau de Lorme was caught in affectionate company with a musician. The court declared that she had sinned in melody. They took away her jewelry, banned her from attending festivals, and sent the musician to dig latrines for the city. A harsh sentence, especially for loving someone with a lute. And then there's the story of Lady Gwyneth of Kent, who faked her husband's death so she could remarry. She claimed he'd been taken by the sea, which was technically true. She pushed him off a boat. He survived, swam to shore, and turned up at her wedding 3 months later. The crowd screamed. He just sighed and said, "I'd like my boots back." No one knew how to sentence her. The church declared it a spiritual misdemeanor. So they annulled her new marriage, fined her for reckless remarriage, and let everyone go home confused. The animal witnesses. Here's a medieval gem. Sometimes animals were brought to court. If a pig killed someone, it could be tried for murder. If a dog bit a priest, it might be imprisoned. There are surviving records, long, serious, beautifully written, describing these trials. In 1386, in Falaise, France, a pig was dressed in human clothes, chained and brought before a judge. A full courtroom, witnesses, a scribe. The judge declared the pig guilty of homicide by mauling. The town executioner was paid to carry out the sentence, but it didn't stop there. In Basel, a rooster was tried for laying an egg, a thing against nature. The poor bird was burned because people believed such eggs hatched demons. Imagine explaining that job. Yes, I'm a chicken prosecutor. Thankfully, by the 1500s, the idea faded. Even medieval people eventually realized it was perhaps a bit much. The sleeping on the job. Crimes falling asleep in the wrong place could also get you in trouble. In monasteries, if a monk was caught dozing during prayer, he had to stand for the next 3 nights, awake, reciting psalms. A brutal punishment, especially since monks already woke up at 2 a.m. to chant. There's a note in the Chronicle of St. Gall where a monk writes, "Brother Peter was discovered asleep during matins and confessed the sin of sloth. He was given the psalm of regret and 3 nights' vigilance." 3 nights. It sounds like medieval Red Bull hadn't been invented yet. The peasant who talked back finally. Let's talk about the crime of talking back. Because in a society where hierarchy was everything, disrespect was a big deal. A peasant who insulted a knight could be whipped. A servant who mocked his lord could lose his job, or his teeth. But one story stands out. Hugh the Miller of Nottingham, 1357. Hugh was asked to pay extra grain tax. He refused and said, and I quote, "May the sheriff's backside grow mold before I pay another penny." A fantastic insult, honestly. He was fined, whipped, and banned from town for a year. But after his death, locals painted his face on a pub sign, "The Miller's Revenge." So, in a way, he won. The accidental crimes, and then there were the accidents that somehow became crimes. Like knocking over a candle that burned a tapestry, technically property destruction, or sneezing during a noble speech, disrespect by noise. A poem, court record from 1278. tells of a young squire who accidentally tripped over a bishop's robe during procession. The bishop fell, lost his hat, and yelled, "The devil is in this boy." They exorcised him. He was 15. The note at the bottom of the record says, "No devil was found." Good to know they checked. The quiet irony of it all. What's strange when you read these old legal records is how familiar they feel. Everywhere, people trying to get ahead, people showing off, people getting caught for doing something silly, and most of all, people trying to look better than they were. Which, when you think about it, might be the most medieval crime of all. So, as we settle deeper into this long, slow drift through medieval absurdity, remember, for every grand knight and tragic queen, there were bakers fined for light loaves, monks punished for naps, and peasants exiled for bad jokes. They weren't heroes or villains, just people, tired, hungry, proud, and occasionally ridiculous. And that's what makes history quietly beautiful, even in its most boring, bureaucratic, cabbage-throwing moments. The crimes of kindness, when compassion was illegal, so we've seen all the absurd ways medieval people got punished. But there's one more category of criminal that doesn't fit neatly into the others. The ones who broke rules not for greed or vanity, but for kindness, the quiet rebels. The monks who fed the poor when they weren't supposed to. The servants who hid fugitives. The doctors who treated the wrong kind of patients. Their crimes were gentle. Their punishments sometimes harsh. And their stories, like everything else from the Middle Ages, are equal parts strange, sad, and quietly beautiful. The forbidden healer. Let's start in a small village near Canterbury, sometime around 1320. A woman known only as Mother Ellen was famous for healing. She used herbs, prayer, and something suspiciously like common sense. People came from miles around. Unfortunately, she wasn't licensed by the church, and since medicine and theology were basically the same career back then, that was a big problem. She was charged with practicing healing arts without divine sanction, in modern terms, illegal kindness. When asked why she treated people, Ellen said, "Because they were ill." The bishop didn't find that compelling. He sentenced her to stop healing until granted permission. She ignored it, of course. Years later, parish records show villagers still visiting the widow with the herbs. She died peacefully, unrepentant. And the irony? Her grave became a local pilgrimage site for people seeking cures. The kind monk and the hungry orphans next. A story from France, 1247. Brother Guillaume was a Benedictine monk, known for being annoyingly kind. While the monastery dined on fresh fish and cheese, he'd sneak food out the side door to feed orphan children waiting by the wall. When the abbot found out, he accused Guillaume of wasting holy provisions. The trial, yes, there was a trial, took place in the refectory. Guillaume admitted everything calmly. He said, "Our Lord fed 5,000. I fed 6. The scale is small, but the math holds." The monks didn't quite know what to do with that. They gave him a month of penance, but also quietly started leaving extra loaves out near the gate each evening. Technically, everyone was breaking the rule now. But it's nice to think they slept a little better for it. The runaway nun, our next criminal, was a nun named Beatrix of Rudesheim, Germany, around 1380. Beatrix had one flaw. She couldn't stop trying to help people. When a local farmer was imprisoned for debt, she started sneaking bread into the dungeon through a loose brick in the wall. She even convinced 2 other nuns to take turns helping her. Eventually the jailer caught them, not because he saw them, but because he noticed the prisoners were looking. Too healthy. The 3 nuns were summoned by the abbess, who told them sternly, "The Lord does not bless deceit." Beatrix replied, "Then may he forgive me, for I will deceive again tomorrow." She was exiled to another convent as punishment, which, frankly, sounds more like a transfer. Records show she continued her habitual mercy for another decade before dying quietly in her sleep. The merchant who refused to cheat in medieval trade, everyone was expected to bend the rules a little. Taxes were dodged, weights were rigged, and royal inspectors were bribed with barrels of ale. But one merchant, Niccolò di Bardi, a Florentine cloth dealer, refused. He charged fair prices, refused to shortchange customers, and refused to join the Merchant Guild's secret price-fixing club. They hated him for it. They called him Il Matto Buono, the good fool. Eventually, the guild fined him for dishonoring his trade through excessive honesty. Imagine that. Punished for being too fair, he paid the fine, double in fact, and gave the extra to the city orphanage. Later, a Florentine chronicler wrote that his conscience was poor, but his soul was well dressed. Not bad for a man who sold cloth. The thief who returned everything. There's a small entry in the London court rolls of 1365 about a thief who robbed a spice merchant, then returned everything 2 weeks later. His name was Will Tanner. He'd stolen cloves, pepper, and 2 silver spoons, but guilt, or maybe fear, got the better of him. He returned the goods at night with a note that said simply, "I took this." It felt wrong. The merchant turned the note in, and the judge decided to make an example. Will was summoned to court, where the merchant surprised everyone by pleading for leniency. He said, "If the man can steal and still listen to his soul, he is more righteous than many who sit in pews." The judge let Will go. It's one of the few medieval cases recorded as forgiveness granted by both parties. No one knows what happened to him after that, but maybe somewhere he opened a small shop and sold things honestly. The peasant who shared water, it sounds simple now, but water could be political. In many towns, wells were taxed, controlled by the local lord. Peasants who took or shared extra could be fined or whipped. In 1421, during a drought in Burgundy, a farmer named Etienne was caught giving water to a neighboring village's children. Technically, this was theft of the lord's property. He argued that water fell from heaven, not from the manor roof. They fined him anyway. But the next night, villagers broke the lock on the well and started carrying buckets to every house. No one said a word. By morning, the well was mysteriously empty, and the Lord mysteriously unable to find witnesses. Sometimes mercy spreads faster than authority. The doctor who healed the unworthy. Medicine was often bound by rank. Nobles got treatment. Peasants got prayers. But one physician, Magister Rolandus of Lyons, ignored the rule entirely. He treated beggars and lepers for free. Worse still, he treated prostitutes, which was considered both unseemly and professionally degrading. His colleagues filed a complaint saying he debased the noble art of healing. When summoned, Rolandus said, "If the soul of a beggar weighs less than a lord's, then I have misunderstood God." The city fined him. He paid it, in copper coins, which took so long to count that the officials gave up halfway through. He died in poverty, but his students later became some of the first doctors to formally treat plague victims without charge. The ripple of one kind man. The soldier who refused an order, even in war, mercy could be a crime. In 1410, during the Polish-Teutonic conflict, a young soldier named Jakub the Small was ordered to burn a village suspected of harboring spies. He refused. When the commander demanded an explanation, Jakub said, "There are children there. My sword has no quarrel with them." He was flogged and dismissed from the army. The next winter, that same village took him in when he was starving. They didn't know who he was, just that he looked tired and honest. It's easy to romanticize it, but that story appears in several chronicles. Even if embellished, It feels like the kind of truth people wanted to believe. The soldier who refused an order even in war, mercy could be a crime. In 1410, during the Polish-Teutonic conflict, a young soldier named Jakub the Small was ordered to burn a village suspected of harboring spies. He refused. When the commander demanded an explanation, Jakub said, "There are children there. My sword has no quarrel with them." He was flogged and dismissed from the army. The next winter, that same village took him in when he was starving. They didn't know who he was, just that he looked tired and honest. It's easy to romanticize it, but that story appears in several chronicles. Even if embellished, it feels like the kind of truth people wanted to believe, that kindness, though punished, sometimes circles back, the king who pardoned the wrong people. Now here's a twist. Occasionally, kindness came from the top and still caused trouble. King Henry VI of England was famously soft-hearted. He pardoned thieves, murderers, and anyone who cried convincingly enough. Parliament eventually begged him to stop. One record from 1452 shows he pardoned a group of bandits on account of their heartfelt repentance and reasonable tears. A chronicler dryly added, "They were hanged the following year for fresh crimes." But Henry never changed. When advisers told him he was too merciful, he replied, "Then let my sin be gentleness." It's not the kind of line that wins wars, but it does make for a peaceful bedtime ending. The anonymous donor finally, a story that probably isn't entirely true, but deserves to be. In a monastery near Ghent, records mention a mysterious benefactor who left gold coins at the door each winter. No name, no trace. Just a note that read, "For those whom mercy forgot." The monks tried to catch him for years. One night, a novice claimed he saw a hooded man with a limp who vanished when I called out. The next morning there were more coins. Whoever he was, the tradition lasted 2 generations. Even after the coins stopped, villagers still left food at the monastery door every winter, for those whom mercy forgot. And so, when we look back, it's easy to focus on the cruelty, the wars, the punishments. The darkness gets remembered because it was loud. But beneath it all were these small, quiet rebellions of goodness. A monk sharing bread, a doctor ignoring status, a thief returning what he took, a farmer giving away his well water. They broke the law, yes, but sometimes the law was smaller than the human heart. And that maybe is what makes medieval history oddly comforting. Even in a world of gallows, greed, and gossip masks, kindness still found its cracks to shine through. So, if you're still awake, and which you probably shouldn't be, remember this as the candles fade. The past wasn't just brutal. It was also quietly, imperfectly kind. Every age has its criminals, but some of them are only guilty of being better than the rules allowed. The legacy of forgotten lives, how old souls shaped memory and history. When we think of history, we picture crowns, wars, inventions. But the truth is softer. History is built not by the mighty, but by the many, by hands that never touched gold, by feet that never walked marble floors, by people whose names are dust, but whose lives still ripple quietly through time. This is their part of the story. The invisible foundation beneath everything we remember, the unnamed builders, every cathedral you've ever seen, Notre Dame, Canterbury, Chartres, stands because of thousands of hands that history never wrote down. We know the architects' names, maybe a bishop or two, but the men who carved the angels, the women who carried stones, the children who mixed lime mortar, they're gone from every record. Yet they left fingerprints in the walls, literally. In 2015, archaeologists found tiny handprints, children's, pressed into medieval tiles at a construction site in England. Little palms preserved in clay for 700 years. Maybe the child was playing. Maybe they were helping a parent. Either way, that small, smudged hand says, "I was here." They built something that outlived them by centuries. And in that way, they did what every human hopes to do: leave a mark. However faint, the lost voices of the fields, if you had lived in the 13th century, your life would likely have been measured by seasons, not years. Spring, planting; summer, sweating; autumn, harvesting; winter, waiting. Peasants left almost no written words. They couldn't afford parchment or schooling, but their language survives in the songs and sayings that filtered upward, the scraps of wisdom that scholars later recorded without knowing their source. Phrases like "many hands make light work" or "the wheel turns for all use," those didn't come from kings. They came from field workers and mothers and carpenters who learned patience by necessity. Their philosophy was simple and maybe wiser than all the sermons: work, endure, share, rest. Their words still shape ours, even when their names don't. The forgotten teachers in every medieval town, there was at least one person who could read, and taught others quietly, sometimes illegally. A wandering clerk, a priest's apprentice, a widow who had once been a scribe. They taught children to write their names, or to read a psalm, or to sign a contract without being cheated. No one recorded them. But centuries later, literacy spread because of those small acts. Knowledge, like kindness, travels invisibly. Some historians call it the hidden current, the way small. Private learning flows under the surface of grand history, until one day it bursts into daylight. Without them, the Renaissance might have arrived decades later. They never knew they were changing the world, but they were. The servants who remembered, in castles and manors, servants saw everything: the scandals, the feasts, the cruelty, the kindnesses. They couldn't speak freely, but their memories became oral histories. When they told their grandchildren, stories survived that no chronicle dared to. Right, there's a 15th century collection of tales from England, written long after the events, that describes a lady who loved too proudly, and a knight who wept for his horse. Scholars can't find the original sources. Most likely they began as gossip whispered in kitchens and laundries. In that way, servants became the memory of their age, not in ink, but in words passed down like secret inheritance. They carried history in their tongues, and that's why some stories of emotion and humanity still survive, even when the official records only talk of taxes and wars. The midwives and the mothers. When historians talk about population, they talk about birth rates. But behind every birth was a woman, and beside her, a midwife. These women kept entire generations alive without formal medicine or education. They used herbs, warm water, whispered prayers, and experience passed hand to hand. They had no titles, but they shaped the literal continuation of society, and they were often feared for it. Some were accused of witchcraft, simply because they understood life and death better than the men who judged them. Yet the knowledge they kept quietly flowing from mother to daughter, from one tired hand to another, became the backbone of medicine centuries later. Their legacy lives in every hospital and nursery, though no one remembers their names. The wanderers. Every era has its wanderers: tinkers, beggars, pilgrims, minstrels, people who seem to own nothing and belong nowhere. But they were the lifeblood of connection. They carried songs, news, and ideas from town to town, spreading culture before books could. A tune hummed in a tavern in York might find its way to a fisherman in Flanders within a year. No printing press, just voices. Those anonymous travelers tied medieval Europe together like invisible threads. When historians map how stories and songs spread, they find the fingerprints of these forgotten feet everywhere. We remember kings as the rulers of land, but it was the wanderers who ruled the roads. the slaves and servants of empires across Africa, Asia and the Middle East, forgotten lives built empires. Slaves who carried stones for palaces, servants who managed households so vast that their masters barely knew how they worked, and yet some of them, through quiet persistence, became the memory keepers of their people. In Islamic history, freed slaves sometimes became scholars or poets. In the Ottoman world, some of the most trusted advisors were once servants. Their words, diaries, and oral stories now form some of the most human records of those centuries. Their legacy is not grand, but it is lasting, proof that humanity does not vanish even under chains. The unheard artists in medieval art, thousands of carvings, frescoes, and manuscripts bear no signature. Art was made for God, not for glory, or so the rule said. But sometimes, if you look closely, you find tiny acts of rebellion. A stonemason carving his own face into a gargoyle, a scribe doodling a cat chasing a mouse in the margin of a holy book, a glassmaker slipping a single red shard into an otherwise blue window, just because he could. These were their ways of whispering, "I was here, I saw beauty, I wanted to leave some behind." And now, when visitors admire those works, they're unknowingly seeing through the eyes of those forgotten creators, the laughter, boredom, and quiet pride frozen in stone and light. The invisible inventions. Many medieval inventions came from unknown craftsmen, tinkers, blacksmiths, glassblowers, whose ideas spread without credit. The windmill, the mechanical clock, even simple things like buttons and eyeglasses. Almost all came from workshops where no names were recorded, but their impact shaped everything. They made time measurable. They made reading possible for aging monks. They made life slightly easier, a rare miracle in the Middle Ages. Their genius didn't make them rich. But centuries later, we still live in the world their hands made, the memory of the forgotten. Here's a strange thought. Most people who ever lived, billions, are forgotten. And yet their influence still hums quietly in everything. Every gesture you make, every tool you use, every tradition you follow. It traces back to someone somewhere, whose name never made it into a book. They built our roads and recipes, our languages and lullabies. They taught patience by surviving. They taught resilience by enduring, and that is their legacy, not fame. Not monuments, just continuity, the unbroken thread of ordinary humanity. The graveyards without names in every European countryside, there are small, unmarked cemeteries. Places where plague victims or paupers were buried without inscription. No epitaphs, no stones, just grass and silence. When archaeologists uncover these graves, they often find traces of care, a coin in a child's hand, a rosary on a woman's wrist, a few wildflowers pressed into the soil. Even when people had nothing, they gave what little tenderness they could. That too is history, the quiet compassion of the poor. The ground remembers even when books do not. The echo that remains. History, in the end, is a kind of echo. It grows faint but never fully disappears. And the most beautiful part is that we can still feel the warmth of those who were never meant to be remembered. When you walk on an old road, you walk where countless forgotten feet once passed. When you read a prayer or a proverb, you speak words that once sat on someone's tongue in a smoky cottage or a monastery cell. When you watch rain slide down a stone cathedral, you're seeing the dreams of people who lived and died believing they were ordinary. But there is no ordinary life. Everyone leaves a trace, and so as the candle burns low, the kings are gone, the empires have faded. But the whispers of the forgotten still fill the quiet spaces of the world, in the architecture, in the language, in the customs that never died. They were never written about. But in a way we are all their continuation, the farmer's patience, the servant's diligence, the healer's compassion, the wanderer's curiosity, all of it still lives in us quietly, like a second heartbeat from the past. So if you're still listening, or maybe half asleep now, let that thought rest with you. You don't have to be remembered to matter. You just have to live kindly, work honestly, and leave something gentle behind. Because history isn't built by heroes, it's built by the hands no one saw. And maybe that's the most comforting truth of all. The night after history, how medieval people rested, dreamed, and let go, you know. When we talk about the Middle Ages, we usually talk about war, faith, famine, the big, heavy things. But the truth is, most of life wasn't like that. Most of it was waiting, resting, working quietly. And when the day finally ended, people did something we rarely imagine in history books. They went to bed. It sounds simple, but in a world with no electricity, no clocks, and endless superstition, night was a completely different universe. To the medieval mind, the world after sunset belonged to someone else. To God, to spirits, to dreams. So before we end this long drift through medieval life, let's spend one last slow hour in that ancient darkness. Let's fall asleep with them. When the candles went out, imagine it's the year 1370. You've worked all day, or prayed, or begged, or stitched, or cooked. The air smells like wood smoke and damp wool. Someone just banked the fire with ash. The only light is a single candle, trembling slightly with every breath of air. People didn't sleep the way we do now. They had what historians call segmented sleep. 2 sleeps with a waking hour in between. You'd go to bed right after sunset, first sleep, wake up around midnight, sit by the fire, pray, talk, sometimes make love, sometimes just think. Then drift into second sleep until dawn. This middle of the night hour was considered sacred, a quiet pocket of peace. Writers called it the watch or the hush. It was the time when dreams felt real enough to touch. The sounds of the night. The medieval world was never truly silent. If you lived in a city, you'd hear dogs barking, donkeys braying, distant bells marking the hours. If you lived in the countryside, owls, crickets, maybe a fox crying. But the loudest sound was almost always wind. Wooden shutters creaked. Thatch rustled. The world felt alive but slow. People believed that at night souls wandered, that dreams were messages, that every sound, even the crack of a log in the fire, might be a whisper from something unseen. So they prayed before bed. They crossed themselves 3 times, and sometimes they left bread and milk on the hearth for wandering spirits, so they may pass in peace. A superstition, sure, but also a gesture of hospitality toward the unseen. There's something gentle in that. What beds were like, forget the big royal canopies. Most medieval people slept on straw nest literally. A pallet or truss of hay. You'd unroll it on the floor, maybe with a linen sheet if you could afford one. Families often shared the same bed for warmth, and yes, privacy was not a thing. The straw mattress was changed only a few times a year. In winter it smelled of smoke. In summer of earth. But it was comfort. And that's what mattered. In noble houses, beds were raised wooden frames with heavy curtains to keep out drafts and insects. Servants sometimes slept inside the same room, curled up on benches or under tables, always ready if needed. So when we picture medieval sleep, it's not solitude. It's shared breathing, shared dreams, and the sound of someone shifting quietly beside you in the dark. The dreams themselves. Dreams were serious business in the Middle Ages. They weren't just dreams. They were messages, divine, prophetic, or sometimes demonic. Books like the Dream Book of Daniel or Somniale Danielis were medieval bestsellers. They claimed to interpret any dream. If you dreamed of water, you would soon receive news. If you dreamed of bread, a guest was coming. If you dreamed of fire, you should repent immediately. One 14th century monk wrote an entire dream journal filled with visions of fields, clouds, and once a talking goat. He concluded that God sends symbols in the shape of beasts. And honestly, maybe he was right. Who knows what the mind was trying to say in a time with so little light and so much faith? Dreams were also comfort. When the day's labor ended, people dreamed of what they didn't have. Full tables, laughter, loved ones returned. Dreams were their warmth when blankets failed. When people couldn't sleep, insomnia too existed, though they didn't call it that. They called it the wakeful sickness. One medieval doctor advised eating lettuce boiled in milk. Another suggested warm wine and reading the Psalms. And one particularly dramatic 14th century manual simply said, "If one cannot sleep, it is because his conscience stirs." A little harsh, maybe, but ordinary people found their own remedies. Prayers murmured like lullabies, counting beads instead of sheep, watching the fire die out one ember at a time. And perhaps that's what we're doing right now, keeping the same old vigil, hundreds of years later, waiting for rest to arrive on its own. The night workers, not everyone slept. The medieval night had its own quiet economy. There were the night watchmen, who patrolled towns with lanterns and cudgels, calling out the hours like past 1 o'clock and a fair night. Their job was to scare off thieves and check for fires, but also to reassure everyone still awake that the world hadn't ended. There were bakers, rising at midnight to start the morning bread. Monks singing the dark hour prayers. Tavern keepers cleaning up after the last drunk stumbled home. And midwives awake because somewhere nearby, another new life was beginning. The medieval night wasn't dead. It just moved slower, like the world holding its breath. The stars and the faith without city lights. The stars were unbelievable. People saw them every night, sharp, endless, and frightening. For most, they weren't just pretty. They were signs. Astrology and religion mingled freely. Bishops consulted star charts, and kings refused to travel under unlucky skies. A 13th century monk once wrote, "The heavens are God's handwriting." So every time someone looked up at night, a farmer, a soldier, a lonely widow, and they were reading, not science but comfort, proof that there was still order somewhere above them. Love letters and midnight secrets, and of course not everyone slept peacefully. The night was when forbidden things happened. Lovers met behind barns. Priests whispered prayers they weren't supposed to. People wrote letters by candlelight, love letters, confessions, or sometimes just thoughts they couldn't say aloud. One surviving note from the 14th century reads simply, "I write to you while the world is asleep. So I may say the truth, it's anonymous, but it's somehow more real than any royal decree." The medieval night gave people permission to feel, to think, to dream, in a world that demanded obedience by day. When morning came, roosters, bells, the sound of water being poured. The fire stirred, the straw shifted, and life began again. Morning didn't arrive all at once. It seeped slowly through cracks and shutters. People rubbed their eyes, crossed themselves, and murmured, "Deo gratias, thanks be to God." Breakfast was simple, bread, ale, maybe a few dried beans. Then back to the same rhythm, work, noise, duty. But for a brief time each day the night had been theirs, their quiet kingdom of darkness and thought, and that's what made the daylight bearable. Why the past still sleeps inside us, you and I. We live in electric light, constant noise, endless scrolling. We've forgotten how to be still. But the people of the Middle Ages knew how to sit in silence, how to let the night speak. Maybe that's what their world can still teach us. That peace doesn't always mean progress. Sometimes it's just quiet. So when you lie down tonight, imagine it. The candle guttering out. The faint smell of smoke. A room dark enough for stars. And the same sky above you that they once looked at and whispered prayers into. 700 years later, you're still under it. Different world. Same night, the gentle ending. So as this long, sleepy tale finally folds into silence, remember the rhythm of those long-ago lives. The bakers, the beggars, the saints, the sinners, the ones who worked, the ones who prayed, the ones who dreamed. They all went to sleep under the same moon we still see. Their stories may be dust now, but the peace they found in small, ordinary moments still echoes, and maybe in the end, that's what history is for. Not to remind us how they lived, but to remind us how to rest. The poisoners, plotters, and the art of getting away with murder. Let's drift now into a quieter, more sinister corner of medieval crime. Not the noisy streets, not the dark forests full of bandits, but the candlelit chambers of nobles, the delicate hands that stirred powders into goblets, and the whispers behind locked doors. Because not every crime in the Middle Ages involved swords or daggers. Sometimes the deadliest weapon was a cup of wine and a charming smile. Poison was the polite person's murder. Loud violence was for peasants and soldiers. But poison, that was for queens, bishops, and anyone with an education in herbs and patience. And medieval people loved a good poisoning scandal. Half the time they even imagined poison where there was none. Because, well, if your enemy dropped dead mysteriously, it was probably safer to assume poison than admit it was bad meat. One of the most famous names attached to this quiet, deadly art is Tofana, though she technically belongs to the Renaissance. Her legend soaked through medieval folklore. The infamous aqua tofana, a poison disguised as face cream, was supposedly sold to desperate women who wanted to escape abusive husbands, which in a twisted sense made her an early pioneer of marital liberation. A few drops, and the troublesome husband would develop a mysterious illness and conveniently fade away. People whispered that hundreds, maybe even thousands of men met their end this way, but the medieval era had its own precursors. Herbalists, alchemists, and ladies-in-waiting who knew more than they should about remedies. The Borgia family, those icons of Italian corruption, allegedly perfected this art in the late medieval period. And while it's debatable how much of their reputation was propaganda, one can't help but imagine those Roman banquets where every sip might be your last. In England, poison had its place too. The chroniclers loved to accuse women, particularly noble women, of it, because nothing scared medieval men more than an intelligent woman with access to the kitchen. Take Eleanor Cobham, wife of Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester. She was accused of witchcraft and attempting to kill the king by poison. Historians generally agree she was just a scapegoat in a political rivalry, but the accusation alone was enough to end her comfortable life. She was imprisoned for the rest of her days, all for allegedly possessing a wax figure and a few potions. Across the Channel in France, there was Catherine Monvoisin, known as La Voisin. Again, she's from the tail end of the medieval mindset, but her story fits the pattern perfectly. She sold poisons and magic services to the French elite, even allegedly to the mistress of King Louis XIV. Her trade? Helping noblewomen discreetly remove inconvenient people, whether husbands, rivals, or potential heirs. When she was finally caught, the details of her client list nearly caused a royal meltdown. The investigation was quietly shut down because it got too personal. But what's truly fascinating about all this isn't just the poison itself, it's the paranoia it created. Medieval courts were full of rituals to prevent poisoning. Kings had official food tasters, special goblets that supposedly changed color near toxins, and even unicorn horns, which were really narwhal tusks sold for absurd sums, all because people believed they could neutralize any poison. Entire economies revolved around this fear. Merchants traded in bezoars, those weird stones from animal stomachs, as anti-poison charms. The irony, of course, is that most poisons back then were so crude that the real cause of death was probably just bad hygiene. Still, the fascination with poison made it the perfect metaphor for the age: silent, creeping corruption. You never saw it coming until it was too late. Let's float over now to another sort of poison, not the kind you drink, but the kind you speak. Medieval society was obsessed with reputation, and slander could ruin you as thoroughly as a vial of arsenic. There were professional gossipers, yes, really, whose entire livelihood was spreading scandal. And in the courts of kings, rumors were weapons sharper than swords. A whispered word could destroy a dynasty. Take Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful women of the 12th century. Even she wasn't immune. After a failed rebellion against her husband, King Henry II, she was locked up for years and accused of everything from adultery to witchcraft. Why? Because powerful women were always assumed to be scheming. The medieval mind couldn't handle the idea that a woman might be politically competent without being evil. Or look at Joan of Navarre, stepmother to King Henry V. She was accused of trying to poison the king with magical charms, which in reality was just a convenient way to strip her of property. Even as late as the 15th century, being a wealthy widow was dangerous. The quickest way to lose your lands? Have someone claim you were mixing potions in your spare time. Of course, not all poisoners were noble. There were also the local specialists, the village wise women, midwives, and healers. They knew plants, and that made them both useful and terrifying. A few sprigs of nightshade here, a dose of monkshood there. Suddenly your cough syrup becomes a weapon. And because their work was rooted in secrecy and tradition, it was easy for the church to label them as witches. The boundary between herbalism and sorcery was paper thin. In monasteries, too, there were stories. Silent monks brewing potions, though officially medicinal, were rumored to dabble in more experimental mixtures. Medieval apothecaries were the pharmacists of their day, and half their recipes sound like something out of a fantasy novel. Powdered viper, crushed pearls, ground gold, even human bone. Whether they healed or harmed depended entirely on dosage and intent. But if there's one thing all these stories share, it's that intent was everything. Poison was seen not just as a crime, but as a moral corruption. Killing someone in battle could be forgiven. Killing them secretly could not. It violated the chivalric code, the idea that conflict should be open, honorable, and manly. To kill without drawing your sword was, in the eyes of many, the ultimate cowardice. Still, for some people, cowardice was just good strategy. After all, if your rival dies quietly at dinner and you inherit their lands, why bother with messy duels? The chronicles are full of suspiciously timely illnesses, and while no one could prove anything, everyone understood what was going on. Medieval justice wasn't about truth, it was about narrative. If the story made sense, that was enough, and so the poisoner, like the thief or the outlaw, became a part of the medieval imagination, a symbol of the shadow side of civilization. The court might shine with gold and jewels, but underneath it all, someone was always mixing something deadly in a cup. Let's drift onward now, to another kind of quiet criminal, the ones who didn't kill but manipulated, the forgers, the fakers, the bureaucrats with a quill instead of a sword. Because in a world ruled by parchment and seals, a single forged document could change everything. The forgers, fakers, and paper crimes of the Middle Ages so far. We've wandered through the alleys of medieval murder, theft, and poison, crimes of blood and breath. But now let's step into something quieter, a world of ink, wax, and clever handwriting. Because while the knights clanged swords in muddy fields, another kind of battle was happening in the candle-lit rooms of monasteries and chanceries. A war of parchments, of signatures, of fake royal seals that could change the fate of an entire kingdom. Yes, We're talking about the forgers, the fakers, and the bureaucratic tricksters of the Middle Ages. The people who realize that sometimes the pen really is mightier than the sword, especially if it's dipped in deception. Now, forgery in the medieval world wasn't quite what it is today. You couldn't exactly fake a driver's license or a banknote, but you could fake something far more powerful: authority. The Middle Ages were obsessed with documents. Kings ruled by charters, the church by decrees, and land was owned because of grants written on animal skin and stamped with blobs of wax. Most people couldn't read, which meant that whoever held the paper held the power. So naturally, people started making their own. One of the most famous examples, and probably the boldest, is the donation of Constantine. This was a document discovered by the Church, claiming that Emperor Constantine, the Roman one, with the shiny armor and dramatic conversion to Christianity, had granted vast territories, basically half of Europe, to the Pope. It was a masterpiece of political creativity. The text said that Constantine, after being healed of leprosy by Pope Sylvester I, was so grateful that he handed over authority over Rome, Italy, and all the Western Empire to the papacy. A convenient story, of course, since this document conveniently appeared just when the medieval popes were trying to assert dominance over kings. And here's the best part: it worked. For centuries, everyone believed it. Kings bowed, emperors trembled, and popes strutted with the confidence of men who literally owned the West. It wasn't until the 15th century that a scholar named Lorenzo Valla looked at the Latin and said, "Wait a second, this is way too modern." He pointed out words and phrases that didn't even exist in Constantine's time. The whole thing was a fake, an elegant, world-changing lie written on a piece of calfskin. But the donation of Constantine was just the tip of the quill. Forgery was everywhere. Monasteries were perhaps the most enthusiastic participants. In a world where land meant wealth, and wealth meant survival, a well-placed forged charter could make the difference between prosperity and starvation. Imagine being a sleepy abbey in the English countryside. Your fields are shrinking. Your donations are drying up, and the local lord is getting greedy. What do? You find an old parchment saying that King Offa, long dead, conveniently gifted your monastery an extra 500 acres for the glory of God. You age it with candle soot, smear a little beeswax over the ink, and voila, a divine miracle of paperwork. Even the royal courts weren't immune. Some ambitious nobles forged family trees to prove they were descended from Charlemagne. Others faked seals to claim debts had been paid, or that they'd received privileges from long-dead kings. One particularly audacious example comes from 13th century France, where a man forged a royal pardon to get out of prison. He copied the handwriting of a clerk, sealed it with wax stolen from another document, and presented it with confidence. And unbelievably, it worked, man, for a while. Until the real clerk returned and noticed the missing seal. Forgery, it turns out, wasn't just a clerical crime. It was a survival skill. But the biggest hotspot for paper crime was the church. And not just at the high papal level. Down in the dusty record rooms of cathedrals and abbeys. See, every monastery had a chartulary, basically a giant scrapbook of all its important legal documents. Over time, monks would copy old ones to preserve them. But copying, of course, allowed for creative editing. Maybe a scribe adds a sentence saying, "And the bishop also granted us the vineyard by the river." Just a small addition. Nobody would notice, right? Except multiply that by centuries, and suddenly a humble monastery owns half the valley. These weren't evil schemes, not exactly. Most monks believed they were simply restoring what had been lost or clarifying divine will. But by modern standards, it was pure fraud. Holy fraud, perhaps, but fraud nonetheless. There's also something oddly poetic about it all. In a world obsessed with divine truth and absolute authority, people still used lies to shape reality. The parchment became a kind of magic spell. Write the right words, add the right seal, and it became true. Even kings weren't safe from this paper alchemy. The Capetian kings of France, for example, used cleverly worded documents to justify land seizures. England's monarchs issued revised versions of the Magna Carta, each slightly different, each subtly altering history. Every medieval ruler was both a victim and a perpetrator of bureaucratic forgery. And here's a fun twist. Sometimes the forgeries outlived the truth. There are fake documents from the 12th century that became so embedded in legal systems that they stayed valid for hundreds of years. Entire towns, churches, and borders still exist today because of paperwork someone made up in a monastery basement. It's a reminder that history isn't always written by the victors. Sometimes it's written by the forgers. Of course, medieval people weren't blind to the problem. There were whole systems of verification, scribes who compared handwriting, lawyers who inspected seals, bishops who swore oaths of authenticity, but they were often working with limited tools. If a document looked old and smelled faintly of wax, that was usually good enough. So forgery became the invisible crime of the era. No blood, no witnesses, just ink and nerve. And in many ways it was the most medieval crime of all, because it relied on faith. You had to believe the parchment for it to have power. So, as we drift onward through these dimly lit archives of the past, let's take one last detour, not into lies written on paper, but lies told by word of mouth. The medieval gossipers, rumor-mongers, and storytellers who forged not documents, but reputations, because in a world without newspapers, sometimes a whispered tale could destroy a king faster than any forged charter. The gossipers, rumor-mongers, and medieval media manipulators, all right. Let's loosen our collars, pour another imaginary goblet of watered wine, and drift into the soft, smoky world of medieval gossip. Because long before social media, tabloids, or royal documentaries, there was something even more potent, the rumor mill. And the Middle Ages? Oh, they ran on gossip like a cart runs on mud. Information was rare. Printing didn't exist yet. Most people couldn't read. So, the medieval version of breaking news was someone shouting it in the market square, or whispering it to their neighbor while baking bread. And by the time it reached the next village, the story had changed 5 times. In short, the Middle Ages were one long game of historical telephone. Let's start in the courts, because that's where gossip had real power. Imagine a royal palace, a maze of corridors, courtiers, and candle-lit chambers where everyone smiles and bows and secretly hates each other. That was medieval politics in a nutshell, and in that environment, a well-timed rumor could be a weapon sharper than any dagger. Take Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful women in 12th century Europe, queen of both France and England, though not at the same time, thankfully. When her marriage to King Louis VII fell apart, the gossip machine went wild. Chroniclers, all conveniently male, claimed she'd been too worldly, too passionate, and of course too opinionated. Some whispered that she'd seduced her uncle during the Crusades. Others said she bewitched men with her southern charms. None of it was true, of course, but that didn't matter. Gossip didn't need truth. It needed flavor. And once a story stuck, it became history. When she later married Henry II of England and produced a dynasty that changed the continent, the rumors followed her. She was always painted as the dangerous woman, the manipulator behind the throne. Because in medieval storytelling, Strong women didn't lead. They schemed, and she wasn't the only one. Isabella of France, known as the She-Wolf of France, earned her nickname through gossip. The story goes that she and her lover, Roger Mortimer, plotted to overthrow and kill her husband, King Edward II. In truth, the political situation was complicated, as it always is, but the chroniclers loved a scandal. And since Edward II's rule ended in mysterious fashion, let's just say there were uncomfortable rumors involving a red-hot poker, the legend of Isabella as a cold, vengeful femme fatale was born. A few exaggerated details here, a few salacious poems there, and boom, eternal infamy. Medieval gossip was like wildfire in a dry field, and once it caught, it burned for centuries. Now it wasn't just nobles and royals who weaponized rumor. Ordinary people did too, especially when they couldn't fight back against the powerful. In villages and towns, gossip was both a survival tool and a social weapon. Someone wrongs you? Start a rumor. The miller's wife overcharges you for flour. Maybe she's bewitching the scales. The local priest is getting too rich. Perhaps he's sleeping with the widow down the lane. By modern standards, it sounds petty, but in a society without formal justice systems for common folk, gossip was justice. It policed behavior. It kept people cautious. You didn't want to be the subject of whispers, because whispers could lead to trials, exile, or worse. The church, of course, hated this. They spent centuries preaching against tale-bearing and idle chatter. Monks wrote entire sermons about how gossip was a sin worse than theft, which was ironic, considering monasteries were hotbeds of gossip themselves. Imagine dozens of men living together, silently copying manuscripts all day. You can bet they noticed who got extra wine at dinner or who was caught talking to the bishop's page. But gossip wasn't all small talk. Sometimes it became propaganda. The medieval church, for instance, was a master at it. They didn't have PR departments, but they had preachers, the original influencers. When they wanted to shape public opinion, they used the pulpit. Want to discredit an enemy? Tell a sermon about false kings or wicked queens, conveniently describing your rival without naming them. Want to prepare for a crusade? Spread word of terrible heathens committing atrocities, most of which never actually happened. And it worked, because for most people the priest was the only news source. Even the crusades themselves were fueled by rumor, wild stories of miraculous victories, divine visions, and monstrous enemies. By the time they reached Europe, every tale had grown tenfold. It was medieval clickbait, shocking, emotional, impossible to verify. Royal gossip, though, was a league of its own. Take Richard II of England, the so-called boy king. After his deposition, rumor spread that he was still alive, that he'd escaped, gone into hiding, and would return any day. It was like a medieval conspiracy theory. Decades later, imposters were still showing up, claiming to be the real Richard II. People wanted to believe it, because it made the world feel more dramatic, and because nothing was more medieval than refusing to let go of a good story. Another famous one, Joan of Arc. After she was burned at the stake, rumors immediately spread that she'd survived, that another woman had been executed in her place. There were even fake Joans who appeared years later, claiming to be her. The church was not amused, but that's the thing about gossip. It doesn't die, it mutates. And if you think misinformation is a modern problem, the Middle Ages would like a word. One chronicler writes that a comet signaled God's wrath over sinful kings. Another swears that a newborn baby spoke Latin. A third insists that a plague was caused by Jews poisoning wells. Each of these started as gossip, small stories passed from town to town, but when recorded by official historians, they became fact. That's the terrifying power of medieval rumor. It blurred into history so completely that even scholars today struggle to separate the two. The medieval monarchs knew this, of course. Some tried to control their own narratives. Kings hired poets to write flattering chronicles, and bishops edited inconvenient truths. Even royal portraits were a form of reputation management, early Photoshop, but with more velvet. King Richard the Lionheart, for example, spent very little time in England, and even less ruling it, but his PR was so good that he's remembered as a hero. His actual reign was mostly debt, war and imprisonment, but hey, great branding. At the same time, gossip could undo kings just as easily. King Edward IV of England faced a rumor that he wasn't actually royal, that his mother had an affair while his father was away. The Whisper campaign was so successful that decades later, Richard III, yes, the one with the Shakespeare problem, used it to justify taking the throne. And in France, Marie Antoinette's entire downfall, though technically post-medieval, was built on centuries of this same culture. Once a rumor about her spending or her supposed scandals caught on, it didn't matter what was true. The narrative had already won. So yes, the medieval world had no tabloids, but it had taverns, markets, churches and minstrels, each one an early version of Twitter, spreading stories faster than anyone could fact-check them. The gossips weren't just idle talkers. They were the journalists, influencers and spin doctors of their age. They decided who was a saint, who was a sinner, and who got remembered in the stories that survived. And just like today, the truth was often negotiable. So, as we dim our mental candles and let the voices of those long-ago rumor-mongers fade, we can appreciate one thing. The Middle Ages might have lacked the internet, but they had all the same instincts. They too loved scandal, shaped reality with storytelling, and thrived on hearsay disguised as truth. And maybe that's what makes history so strangely familiar. It's just an older version of the same human game, telling stories, spreading gossip, and trying to control what people believe.